Welcome back, guys. Today's episode, I'm sharing 10 true Airbnb horror stories when a vacation turns into a nightmare you can't escape. But before we begin, please make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. Now let's begin. I don't even know where to start, because even now, when I think about that weekend, my chest tightens and my stomach churns. I had booked a small, isolated cabin for some much-needed peace. A break from the city, from work, from people. The listing promised quiet, rustic charm and complete privacy, and for a few hours, it really did feel like that. The drive up was long, winding through forests so thick that the sunlight barely reached the asphalt. Birds chirped in odd rhythms, almost like they were warning me, but I brushed it off. When I arrived, the cabin looked exactly as pictured. Weathered wood, a porch that creaked with every step, and windows that reflected the trees like dark, still pools. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and old books. It was cozy, almost too perfect. The host had left a welcome note, tucked neatly on the counter, and everything seemed meticulously arranged. Then, when I started unpacking, I noticed it, a door at the end of the basement hallway that wasn't mentioned anywhere. I remember thinking it was odd, but maybe it was just for storage, or maybe the pictures had cut it out. It was heavy, old wood with a tarnished brass handle that gleamed faintly in the dim light. My rational brain said, just leave it alone. It's probably nothing. But something about it pulled at me, the kind of curiosity you can't quite control. I spent the next hour exploring the main floor, trying to ignore it. Every time I passed the hallway, my eyes flicked toward that door. It gave off a cold, presence. Not like cold air exactly, but like the air itself was holding its breath. I kept shaking my head, telling myself I was imagining it. But when night fell and the forest outside darkened into an impenetrable shadow, that door didn't just sit there anymore. It felt aware, like it was waiting. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that the isolation had gotten under my skin. But as soon as the sun disappeared behind the trees, the air in the cabin shifted. It was heavier somehow, as if the room itself was pressing down on me. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, slithering across the floor in ways that didn't match the furniture or the flickering lamplight. Then came the sound. A soft, deliberate creak from the basement. At first, I thought it was the old wood settling, but it wasn't. It was coming from the locked door. Slow, almost patient. I froze mid-step, my heart thundering in my chest. I told myself it's probably the wind, but the basement door didn't have a draft. I could feel a vibration in the floor. Subtle, but insistent. Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight and approached it. The handle was cold to the touch, unnaturally so, and when I tried to twist it, it didn't budge. But what made my skin crawl wasn't the door itself. It was the sound behind it. Not a creak or a knock, but a faint dragging, like someone, or something, was moving slowly on the other side. I took a step back, then another. The flashlight flickered, and for a brief, terrifying second I thought I saw the outline of a face pressed against the wood, pale, distorted, eyes wide, and gone the moment I blinked. My rational mind screamed at me that it was impossible. There was no one there. Yet the air felt colder, charged with a presence I couldn't explain. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the living room, flashlight in hand, listening. Every few minutes I heard it again, dragging, shuffling, sometimes a soft whisper, almost like a breath through the crack of the door. Sleep didn't come. I felt watched, trapped, and entirely alone. The cabin that had seemed so inviting hours ago now felt like a trap. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I hadn't moved from that spot. I couldn't bring myself to check the door, yet I couldn't stop thinking about it either. Something was there, something was waiting, and I wasn't sure it would let me leave. I left the cabin that morning feeling hollow, like a piece of me had been left behind in that dark basement hallway. The sun shone warmly on the porch, the birds chirped normally, and the forest looked perfectly peaceful, but I couldn't see any of it. My eyes kept flicking toward the basement door, half expecting to see something moving, something waiting. Rationally, I knew nothing could have been there. The host, the property, the forest, all of it was ordinary. Yet ordinary had never felt so alien. I tried telling myself it was stress, exhaustion, maybe a prank by the previous guests. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The dragging, the whispers, the fleeting face, they didn't belong in my imagination, not with such precise, deliberate timing. Even now, weeks later, I find myself replaying those sounds in my head. Every creak in my apartment, every shadow stretching across my walls at night brings me right back to that door. I called the host later asking about the basement, trying to sound casual. She laughed lightly, reassuring me that it was just a storage closet and that nothing could possibly be inside. I didn't tell her about the noises, or the face. I couldn't. Even now, writing this, I feel a pang of disbelief at myself. Was I exaggerating? Maybe. But the fear I felt was real. Every pulse of my heart, every shiver down my spine was evidence enough for me. And then there's the part I hate admitting. I went back, not to open the door, but to see it, to confirm it was real and not a fragment of my imagination. It sat there, inert, but somehow heavier, more deliberate, like it remembered me. I left quickly, but the unease stayed with me. It lingered in my waking thoughts, in the quiet moments when I was alone. I don't know if anyone will believe me. I don't even know if I fully believe it myself. But there's one thing I know for certain. Some doors aren't meant to be opened. Some presences aren't meant to be seen. And sometimes, no matter how far you run, they follow you. Not physically, but in every shadow, in every sound that your mind can't explain. I had always thought mirrors were harmless. Reflective glass, nothing more, something you glanced into, maybe adjusted your hair, wiped a smudge, and moved on. But the mirror in that Airbnb changed everything I believed. It started subtly, almost innocuously. I had booked a small apartment downtown for a solo trip, a mixture of work and vacation. The host's listing was perfect. Modern furnishings, minimalist charm, all amenities included. Photos showed clean surfaces, bright natural light, and a full-length mirror leaning casually against the bedroom wall. I didn't think much of it when I arrived. Not yet. The apartment itself was lovely, hardwood floors that creaked in soft, reassuring ways, a balcony overlooking the city lights, and a faint scent of lavender that hung in the air, as if someone had left it to welcome me. I unpacked methodically, laying out my clothes, organizing my toiletries, humming quietly as I settled in. That's when I first noticed the mirror. It seemed ordinary at first glance, tall, elegant, framed in dark wood. But as I moved past it, out of the corner of my eye, it felt wrong. The reflection seemed ever so slightly delayed. Not a lag like a bad camera feed, but a fraction of a second behind my movement. My heart skipped, and I told myself I was imagining it. By the second evening, the feeling intensified. I would stand brushing my teeth, and the reflection behind me didn't always match exactly. My hair might fall differently, my posture seemed slightly off, and occasionally there was a shadow, a dark outline that hadn't been there moments before. I chalked it up to fatigue, maybe the result of staring at a computer screen all day. But then came the whispers. Soft, almost inaudible murmurs, barely forming words, echoing like they came from just behind the glass. I froze each time, turning abruptly to find nothing, just the mirror empty, perfectly reflecting the room. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined my reflection moving independently, tilting its head, studying me. When I woke, the mirror seemed unchanged, yet the air around it felt colder, denser, heavier, like it was watching me with intent. I tried to convince myself I was alone. There was no one else in the apartment, but every instinct screamed that something was there, in that glass, waiting. By morning, I could no longer ignore it. I avoided looking directly into the mirror, covering it with a towel for hours, yet the sense of being observed, Ed never left. Something about it was wrong, fundamentally, terrifyingly wrong, and I had no idea how far the horror was about to go. The second night in the apartment, I realized I wasn't dealing with imagination anymore. Whatever it was deliberate. I had tried to sleep, but the room felt charged, suffocating almost. Every sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic outside, even my own breathing, seemed amplified, like the apartment itself was holding its breath, waiting, and the mirror sat silently in the corner, black-framed and unassuming, yet impossibly menacing. It started subtly, with small movements. My reflection wouldn't quite mimic me correctly. I would raise my hand, and it lagged behind, or sometimes my reflection would blink when I hadn't. I stopped looking directly at it, forcing myself to focus on the bed, on the ceiling, anything but the glass. But the sensation of being observed didn't fade. I felt its attention on me, heavy and unrelenting, as if it were more than a reflection, more than a simple surface of glass. Around midnight I heard it. Soft tapping, like fingernails brushing against the wood frame. At first I thought it was someone outside, a neighbor, maybe a branch hitting the window. But the sound was coming from inside, from the mirror itself. My heart raced so violently I could hear it in my ears. I edged closer, flashlight trembling in hand, and the reflection stared back at me. Not me. The face was mine, yes, but the expression was wrong. Lips twisted in a subtle, unnatural smile, eyes dark, observing. My own body froze in the bed, but the reflection shifted independently, leaning closer, watching, waiting. I stepped back, fumbling to turn on the overhead light, but the moment I did, the figure froze. perfectly mirroring me again. My rational mind screamed it was impossible. Mirrors can't move on their own. But the evidence of my senses screamed louder. I tried to leave the room, my shoes clattering against the floorboards, but the weight of unease followed me, as though the mirror had already anticipated my movement. By 3 a.m., I had stopped trying to rationalize. I could feel it in the shadows cast across the walls, in the subtle reflections of the ceiling, even in the faint sheen of the coffee table glass. It was aware of me, and I knew, without question, that I was not alone. The apartment that had seemed welcoming hours ago now pressed in on me, the air thick, the silence distorted. I couldn't escape the sense that the reflection wasn't just watching. It was learning, remembering, calculating. I ended up sitting in the corner of the living room, back to the far wall, avoiding the bedroom entirely, listening. Every creak, every whisper, every flicker of movement reminded me of the mirror's attention. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I didn't breathe without feeling its gaze. That night, I realized one thing with terrible clarity. The reflection wasn't mine, and it wasn't waiting for me to notice. It had already begun to exist alongside me, and it had plans of its own. The next morning, I didn't want to look at the mirror. I couldn't. Even the thought of turning the corner and seeing that dark-framed glass made my stomach twist. Sunlight streamed through the apartment windows, bathing everything in a warm, reassuring glow, but the warmth didn't reach me. I felt hollow, shaken, like the apartment had claimed part of my sanity in the night. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew, with bone-deep certainty, that the mirror wasn't ordinary. I tried to rationalize. Haustian, stress, lack of sleep, the isolation of a solo trip, surely it was all just my mind playing tricks. I convinced myself I had imagined the face that smiled differently from mine, the subtle movements that didn't match my own. Yet every time I closed my eyes, the image returned with startling clarity, those dark eyes, watching, calculating, lingering long after I had looked away. I avoided the bedroom for the rest of my stay. I covered the mirror with a towel I found in a closet, trying to ignore the faint chill that still seemed to emanate from it. Even so, I couldn't escape the sensation of being observed. My reflection seemed to linger in every reflective surface, the polished countertop, the windows, even the screen of my laptop. It was like the mirror had embedded itself into my perception, a silent predator I couldn't escape. By the time I checked out, I felt exhausted and paranoid, scanning the street and apartment hallway for shadows that might follow me. I tried to laugh it off to friends, telling them I must have been tired, overworked, imagining things. They nodded politely, but I could tell they didn't understand. No one could. Because it wasn't just a reflection, it was awareness. A presence that I could feel behind me, even when I wasn't looking. Even now, weeks later, the memory haunts me. I catch glimpses of it in mirrors at home, sometimes thinking I see a subtle distortion of my own reflection. I try to turn away to convince myself I'm imagining it, but the unease lingers. That mirror didn't just watch me while I stayed in the apartment. It followed me, embedding fear where none existed before, leaving me with the sense that some reflections aren't just glass. Some have their own consciousness, their own intent, and their own patience. I don't know if anyone will believe this story. I'm not sure I believe all of it myself, but I know one tracer. That mirror didn't reflect me, it observed me. And whatever it was waiting for the moment I looked away. Or worse, when I thought I was safe. I thought I knew what I was signing up for when I booked that Airbnb. A cozy apartment in a quiet neighborhood, a few blocks from the city center, clean, well-reviewed, everything seemed normal. The host was polite and punctual, leaving a small welcome packet on the kitchen counter with the usual instructions, Wi-Fi password, emergency contacts, and a note wishing me a pleasant stay. It all felt ordinary, too ordinary maybe. The first day passed uneventfully. I explored the neighborhood, grabbed coffee from a local cafe, and returned in the evening feeling tired but content. It was only when I started unpacking that I noticed something tucked beneath the mattress of the bed, a small, folded envelope, yellowed at the edges, with neat handwriting that didn't match anything in the welcome packet. I hesitated, a strange chill running down my spine. I didn't recognize the handwriting, but curiosity won over my apprehension. Inside, I found a few handwritten notes and a USB drive, along with a folded slip that simply read, "Read carefully. Trust no one." At first, I laughed nervously, assuming it was a joke left by a previous guest. Maybe someone had been bored, leaving behind a prank for the next unsuspecting tenant. But the notes were different. They were personal, detailed, and unsettlingly specific. They described strange occurrences in the apartment, objects moving, whispers at night, shadows that didn't align with the furniture. One note mentioned waking up to find the bedroom door locked from the inside, even though it had been wide open before sleep. Another warned about the previous tenant disappearing for hours, only to return without explanation, carrying an expression that could only be described as haunted. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps someone had been dealing with anxiety or paranoia, or maybe the apartment simply had quirks. Old buildings always creak. AK, shadows always shift and people often overreact. Still, a knot of unease formed in my stomach, something about the urgency in the notes, the repeated insistence to stay aware and question everything, made it hard to dismiss. By evening, I plugged in the USB drive, my hands shaking slightly. The files contained more messages, videos, audio recordings, and images that seemed normal at first glance. But as I watched, I realized they were documenting a slow, creeping descent into fear. Objects moved between shots, whispers threaded through audio, and the tenant's own expressions grew increasingly desperate, as if they were being observed, even hunted, while the camera silently recorded everything. I sat back, frozen, feeling the apartment's air grow heavier. Ordinary quiet, unassuming. It had felt safe, but now I understood the warning. Something had been here before me, something had been waiting, and it was still here. I should have stopped after the first note, I really should have, but there was something about the messages, something magnetic and wrong that drew me deeper. That night, I stayed in the apartment alone, the city outside buzzing and distant, while inside, the air seemed to thicken. Every creak of the floorboards, every soft hum of the refrigerator sounded louder than it should have. I couldn't ignore the feeling that I was not alone. I started examining the notes more closely. Each one detailed seemingly mundane events that gradually twisted into unease. A misplaced object, a shadow in the corner, a whisper through the bedroom door. The further I read, the more I noticed similarities with my own experience. Missing items, a cold draft in the hallway, the inexplicable sense of being observed. My heart pounded as I realized I was following the exact path of whoever had stayed here before me. Then I found the audio recordings. They began innocuously, just ambient noise, footsteps, the occasional cough. But soon there were faint sounds I couldn't identify, whispers that didn't match the person speaking on the recording, subtle shuffling noises that implied movement when the tenant was supposedly still. One file was a short clip of the apartment at night, the camera positioned in the corner of the living room. At first, nothing was visible, just shadows stretching across the floor. Then a figure appeared behind the tenant, no more than a silhouette. Still, watching, almost imperceptible. My stomach dropped. I rewound the clip, slow-motioning every frame, and the figure remained, unnervingly consistent, almost patient, as if it knew it was being watched. I looked around the apartment, suddenly hyper-aware of every corner, every shadow. The living room felt smaller, the walls seemed closer, and the air grew cold, biting at my skin. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was here, observing me just as it had observed the previous tenant. The lights flickered once, then twice, and a soft knock came from the bedroom, gentle at first, then more insistent, like the very walls themselves were alive and trying to communicate a warning. I froze, unable to move. Rational thought clashed violently with instinct. It's just the building settling. It's the wind. But the sound didn't match the wind. It came from inside, deliberate, precise, and chillingly human, or not human at all. My breath caught in my throat, and the apartment that had seemed so safe and normal only hours earlier now pressed against me, suffocating, alive. And I knew, without question, that whatever had haunted the previous tenant hadn't left. It was still here, waiting for me to make the next move. I left the apartment that morning feeling hollow, as if the space itself had consumed a part of me. The city outside seemed bright and ordinary, but inside my thoughts were a tangled mess of fear, doubt, and paranoia. Every detail from the previous tenant's messages replayed in my mind, the whispers, the shadows, the slow, deliberate presence that seemed to track every movement. I tried to convince myself it was all coincidence, that my imagination had filled in the gaps, but rationality felt fragile, threadbare, unable to withstand the weight of what I had experienced. Even after checking out, I couldn't escape it. The apartment's layout, the placement of the furniture, the way the light fell across the floor, all of it haunted me. I found myself scanning reflections in my own home, half expecting to see the same subtle movements, the same shadowy figure lurking behind me. The recordings and notes I had taken with me didn't help. Instead, they felt like a tether, a link to something that had followed me beyond the walls of that apartment. I couldn't watch them without feeling the presence grow stronger, as if the act of remembering drew it nearer. Sleep became a challenge. Every creak in my apartment, every gust of wind rattling a window made my heart race. I would wake in the middle of the night, convinced I heard whispers echoing from empty corners. Friends called asking why I seemed on edge, why I was jumpy, but I couldn't explain it. How could I? How do you describe an unseen observer that has the patience to wait, to follow, and to remain just outside the range of perception? The fear was subtle but relentless, like a shadow that lingered on the edges of reality. I tried to distract myself with work, social outings, anything to push the memories away, but it always returned. Every apartment I entered, every rental I stayed in afterward, I checked for signs, the kind of details no one notices unless they've felt watched in the way I had. Mirrors, corners, shadows, gaps in light all became potential hiding spots for whatever had followed me from that place. The worst part is the uncertainty. I don't know if it was supernatural, psychological, or a combination of both. I only know the dread was real, the unease tangible. I understand now why the previous tenant had left warnings, why the notes were urgent and fragmented. It wasn't just fear, it was survival, a desperate attempt to communicate a danger that defies explanation. Even now, weeks later, I hesitate before staying anywhere alone. I check corners, I glance at reflections, and I feel that same weight pressing against me, the sense that I am still being watched. The messages were not just warnings, they were invitations to understand, to recognize the presence, and yet no understanding comes. Only fear remains, and it lingers, patient, relentless, waiting. I had been traveling for weeks before I arrived at that Airbnb. My schedule was tight, my energy low, and the last thing I wanted was drama. The listing was perfect. A modest townhouse on a quiet street, modern interior, and the promise of privacy. The host had left a small welcome basket with snacks and a note that read, "Make yourself at home." I unpacked quickly, eager to collapse onto the bed and finally rest. The apartment was cozy, and the quiet was intoxicating. No city noise, no neighbors, just the faint hum of the heating system and the occasional creak of the floorboards. I unpacked methodically, placing my belongings where they felt natural. That's when I noticed the faint traces of someone else's presence, small, almost imperceptible signs. A mug in the sink that didn't belong to me, a book slightly out of place, the faint scent of cologne in the air. I laughed it off. Perhaps the host's cleaning crew had been there earlier, or maybe the previous guest hadn't left everything behind. Night fell, and I settled in for sleep. I had the curtains drawn, the lights off, and the door locked, or so I thought. About an hour after I dozed off, I woke to the sound of soft footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. My heart skipped, every instinct screaming at me that something was wrong. I sat up, straining to hear. The steps stopped, but then I caught the faintest click, like a doorknob turning, just enough to make my blood run cold. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was the building settling, maybe a neighbor had come in by mistake. But the townhouse wasn't shared, it was entirely private. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The silence stretched, almost unbearable, but there it was again, a soft shuffling outside my door. Panic set in, and I debated calling the host, calling the police, or just pretending to sleep. My mind raced. Whoever, or whatever it wasn't supposed to be there. I checked my phone. No messages, no notifications, no signs of anyone entering or leaving the apartment. My rational side kept saying, "It's nothing, you're imagining it, you're tired." But deep down, I knew better. There was a presence, deliberate and patient, moving through the apartment while I lay helpless, frozen with fear, and that was only the beginning of the night. I couldn't move. My body felt paralyzed, every nerve screaming at me, but my mind was trapped in disbelief. The soft shuffling continued outside my bedroom door, deliberate and steady, like someone, or something, was pacing just out of reach. I wanted to call out, to demand that whoever it was reveal themselves, but my voice refused to form. Every instinct told me to stay silent, to pretend I was asleep, hoping that whatever it was would leave. But the sense of being observed was overwhelming, pressing down on me from every corner of the apartment. Minutes, or maybe hours, passed, though time felt meaningless. I could hear subtle, almost imperceptible movements in the living room, faint creaks in the floorboards as if someone were testing the apartment, learning its limits. Then came a sound that made my stomach drop, the quiet drag of something across the floor. Not a chair, not a bag, something deliberate, methodical, slow. The dragging stopped at the edge of my bedroom door. I could feel it there, just beyond the threshold, like a weight pressing against the door itself. I whispered to myself, trying to maintain rationality. It's just a dream. It's exhaustion. It's nothing. But the air had changed. It felt denser, colder, as though the apartment itself had shifted in response to the intruder's presence. I reached for the phone on the nightstand, planning to dial the host or emergency services. My hand trembled violently, and the moment I touched it, the shuffling stopped. Silence. Perfect, suffocating silence, so complete that every sound in my own body, the rapid pulse of my heart, the shallow, uneven breaths, was deafening. Then, just as suddenly, a knock came from the door. Soft, deliberate. 1, 2, 3 knocks. I froze, stomach twisting, convinced I would wake up to see a face staring through the door. Another pause, then a fourth knock. Longer, heavier, resonant in a way that felt almost purposeful, like a message I couldn't understand but instinctively knew was directed at me. My rational mind screamed that someone couldn't have been there. The apartment was locked, the neighborhood quiet, but the evidence was undeniable. I sat in the dark, gripping the phone, staring at the door, unable to summon the courage to look or move. I felt a presence lingering beyond the threshold, patient and calculating, aware of every heartbeat, every tremor, every flicker of fear. I realized then that I was not alone in the apartment, not in the way one might expect, but in a way that defied reason. Whatever had entered, whatever had come into my private space, wasn't just visiting, it was learning, observing, waiting, and I knew, with a clarity that made my blood run cold, that the night was far from over. I left that Airbnb the next morning with a sense of hollow defeat. My body felt heavy, my mind exhausted, and yet the memories of the night clung to me like a second skin I couldn't shed. Every step out the door, every inhale of fresh air felt tainted by what had happened. The city outside was normal, indifferent to my terror, but the apartment, the walls, the dark corners, the hallways, remained alive in my memory. It wasn't just a building, it was a witness, and I had felt its presence, calculated and deliberate, throughout the night. I replayed every sound over and over in my mind, the soft shuffling outside the bedroom door, the deliberate drag across the floor, the knocks that carried intention. I couldn't escape them. Rational thought tried to intervene. It's just fatigue. You're overworked. Maybe someone entered without your knowledge. But every instinct screamed otherwise. The timing, the patience, the almost sentient precision. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. Yet the proof existed in my trembling limbs and pounding heart, in the sweat that had soaked my pajamas and the nausea that refused to dissipate for hours afterward. Sleep didn't come for days. Whenever I closed my eyes, I could feel the presence waiting just beyond my bedroom door. Patient, observing, almost mocking. Shadows at home seemed alive in a way they never had before. I found myself checking locks obsessively, scanning empty hallways, double-checking windows. The paranoia felt contagious, spreading through every corner of my mind. I wanted to forget, to convince myself it was just imagination, but the clarity of Hat night refused to be dismissed. Even now, weeks later, I am wary of rented spaces. I check every corner, every closet, every shadow before settling in. The apartment taught me something horrifying. Isolation is a vulnerability. Privacy is an illusion. And sometimes, presence doesn't need form to be real. It doesn't need a face, a voice, or even movement. It only needs patience and the willingness to watch while you are trapped in your own fear. I cannot explain what happened, and I don't even know if I want to. The uncertainty is part of the terror, the lingering weight pressing against my thoughts, waiting for me to relax, to let my guard down. The night in that apartment didn't just scare me, it changed me. I am constantly aware of the world around me now, hyper alert to the faintest creak, the softest footstep, the subtlest draft. And sometimes, in quiet moments, I swear I can feel it. The uninvited visitor, just behind me, patient, watching, knowing I am aware but powerless to stop it. I had stayed in dozens of Airbnbs before, but the one I booked that weekend was unlike any other. The listing promised comfort, modern design, and a quiet, private environment, exactly what I wanted after a hectic week of work and travel. When I arrived, the apartment looked perfect. Soft lighting, polished wooden floors, and walls painted in calming shades of cream. The host had left a small welcome note and a packet of instructions, which I barely glanced at before unpacking my things. I was too eager to settle in, too exhausted to pay attention. The apartment had 3 rooms, all connected by a narrow hallway. One of them, a spare bedroom, caught my eye immediately. It seemed normal at first. Neat bed, side table, a small bookshelf. But there was something about it that made me pause. It felt off, though I couldn't put my finger on why. The air seemed heavier, denser, and the light seemed to bend oddly in the corner. I told myself it was just fatigue, a result of travel and stress. Still, I found myself drawn to that room, peeking inside multiple times as if some invisible force was urging me to pay attention. That first evening, I tried to relax. I cooked a simple dinner, watched a few shows on my laptop, and then decided to check out the spare room one more time. That's when I noticed it. The room didn't stay the same. A small book on the shelf, which I had already arranged neatly, had shifted slightly. A chair that had been tucked under the desk was now angled toward the door. I laughed nervously, telling myself I must have moved it subconsciously. Yet, the feeling of being watched, of the room observing me, only grew stronger. I spent the night uneasy, sleeping fitfully while imagining subtle changes in that room. Each time I woke, I checked again. Sometimes the bedspread appeared slightly wrinkled, as though someone had lain there even though I knew I was alone. Other times, the closet doors, which I had closed tightly, would be slightly ajar in the morning. Rational thought tried to intervene. Old buildings settle, air drafts shift things, your mind is exhausted. But I couldn't shake the sense that the room was alive, responsive, deliberately rearranging itself while I wasn't watching. By the second day, I noticed the changes happening even when I was present. The room seemed aware of my gaze, subtly adjusting itself as though it knew what I expected and twisted the outcome just slightly to unsettle me. I felt trapped in an invisible game, unable to predict or control the environment. That room, which had seemed ordinary and mundane, was now a source of constant anxiety. Its subtle manipulations, almost imperceptible, created a quiet terror that gnawed at my mind, leaving me restless, hyper-aware, and entirely unsettled. By the second night, the room had become an obsession. Every sound, every shadow, every flicker of movement felt magnified within that space. I tried to convince myself it was paranoia, a trick of exhaustion, or perhaps a residual unease from previous Airbnb stays. But the evidence was mounting. I could no longer ignore the subtle shifts, the chair that moved, the book that slid, the faint impression in the bedspread that suggested someone, or something, had been there. My rational mind screamed for explanation, but my body and instincts were paralyzed in disbelief. That night, I was woken by the sensation of being watched. It was subtle at first, a prickling along the back of my neck, the unmistakable feeling that eyes were tracking every twitch of my body. The room seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting imperceptibly as though it had a life of its own. I forced myself out of bed, gripping my phone as a makeshift weapon, and cautiously approached the spare room. The moment I stepped inside, I felt the air grow colder, heavier, almost viscous, pressing against my skin and making each breath a conscious effort. Then the changes became undeniable. A stack of books that had been neatly aligned earlier was now scattered across the floor. The chair, which had been positioned against the far wall, had turned fully toward me, though I had not touched it. The bedspread was wrinkled in a pattern that suggested recent use, though I had been alone the entire evening. My heartbeat accelerated as the room seemed to close in, its corners darker, the shadows more defined, moving subtly as if alive. Every rational explanation I tried to muster, drafts, settling, imagination, crumbled in the face of what I was experiencing. I backed out of the room, shaken, only to notice that the hallway outside now seemed to stretch unnaturally. The angles of the walls appeared slightly skewed, almost elongating the space, and the door to the spare room seemed further away than before. I felt as though I had crossed some invisible threshold, one that allowed the room to manipulate not just objects but perception itself. I realized, with a cold clarity, that this was not just subtle rearrangement, it was intentional. The room was aware of me. It was observing, learning, and adjusting its environment to unsettle me further, to erode my confidence and my sense of safety. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, unable to sleep, listening to faint creaks and occasional whispers that seemed to emanate from the room itself. Every flicker of shadow against the walls made me flinch, and I found myself compulsively checking the room for signs of movement. Exhaustion finally overtook me, but even in sleep, the image of that altered, responsive room haunted me. Its subtle, deliberate manipulations had become a source of terror I could neither ignore nor rationally explain. By morning, I knew that my perception of reality had been challenged, and that the room had won, leaving me anxious, paranoid, and unmoored. I left that Airbnb feeling unmoored, as if part of my mind had been trapped inside that room. The city outside was normal, bustling with life, completely indifferent to the terror I had endured, but inside me everything had shifted. The memory of that room, the subtle manipulations, the cold, heavy air, the deliberate shifts of objects, clung to my thoughts, refusing to let go. Rationality and fear collided violently. I knew my experience might sound insane to anyone else, but it was real, undeniably real, and I felt its effects in every nerve and muscle. Even days later, I couldn't stop replaying the events in my mind, the way the room seemed aware of my gaze, how objects moved subtly in response to my attention, the unnatural perception of the hallway. Stretching and contracting, all of it left me on edge. I began avoiding small, quiet spaces in my own home, imagining they too could be alive, waiting to manipulate me. Every corner, every shadow became suspect. The experience had rewired my perception, training me to scan constantly, to doubt even the most ordinary occurrences. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the presence of the room lingering behind my eyelids, alive and patient, waiting for me to make a careless move. Shadows in my bedroom, the way the sheets fell, even the faint hum of the ceiling fan became triggers for panic. Rational explanations, stress, exhaustion, imagination, no longer sufficed. The experience had crossed a boundary I could never uncross, leaving me hyper-aware and perpetually anxious. I couldn't stop thinking about the intentionality of it. Most haunted stories, most unsettling experiences are explained away or framed as coincidences, but the room had been deliberate. Every change, every subtle adjustment seemed aimed at destabilizing me, testing the limits of my perception and my sanity. I felt violated in a way I hadn't known was possible. This wasn't just fear, it was a quiet, creeping domination of space and mind. Even now, months later, I catch myself imagining that rooms, closets, and corners can act independently. Every Airbnb I stay in, every unfamiliar apartment, I approach with caution, double-checking, analyzing, anticipating. The memory of that room is etched into me, a lesson in the vulnerability of isolation and the fragility of perception. I don't know if anyone will ever believe my experience, but the lingering terror is undeniable. The room wasn't just a place, it was a presence, patient, observant, and relentless. And I know deep down that some spaces are more than they appear. I thought I had seen it all. After the previous experiences, I had become cautious, skeptical, even hyper-aware of my surroundings when staying in Airbnb rentals. But the apartment I booked that weekend introduced a completely different kind of unease, one that was invisible until discovered, yet terrifyingly intimate. The listing promised a modern, well-lit studio, ideal for solo travelers. The photos online depicted a bright, clean space with large windows and minimalist decor. Everything seemed normal when I arrived. The host had provided all the usual instructions and even left a small welcome basket with snacks and a handwritten note. "Hope you enjoy your stay. Make yourself at home." The first evening passed without incident. I unpacked, tidied the small apartment, and settled in with a book. Everything seemed ordinary, yet there was a subtle, nagging feeling in the back of my mind, like someone was observing me even when I was alone. I shook it off as exhaustion from travel. Still, the sensation didn't leave. When I moved from the kitchen to the living area, I noticed small, almost imperceptible reflections of light in odd angles, glinting from corners that shouldn't catch it. At first, I assumed it was the stainless steel appliances or the polished countertops, but something felt wrong, too precise, too intentional. The next day, while cleaning up after breakfast, I found a tiny black dot near the ceiling in the corner of the living area. It was small, almost invisible, but my instincts screamed at me. I grabbed my phone and zoomed in, trying to discern what it could be. The dot was perfectly round, like the lens of a camera, positioned to observe both the living and sleeping areas. My stomach dropped, and a cold knot of dread formed. My mind raced. No, it can't be. There's no way anyone would do this. Would they? I double-checked the apartment, scanning corners, behind curtains, even opening electrical outlets to look for anything suspicious. My heart pounded in my chest. Every logical explanation was failing me. Whoever had placed this lens had planned meticulously, ensuring it remained hidden, observing without detection. The intimacy of the intrusion was almost suffocating. I realized with a terrifying clarity that I had been unknowingly watched from the moment I entered, my privacy violated in the most insidious way possible. By the evening, the fear had settled like a physical weight in my chest. The apartment no longer felt like a safe haven. It felt like a trap. Every movement, every sound, every breath was potentially recorded. I didn't sleep that night, checking the hidden lens repeatedly, paranoid that I would miss another detail. The violation was more than physical. It was psychological, leaving me vulnerable, exposed and powerless in a way I had never experienced before. I knew the presence wasn't supernatural this time. It was human, methodical, and patient, and that realization made it far more terrifying. That night I couldn't relax. Every movement I made in the apartment felt amplified, every sound unbearably loud. The hidden lens in the corner of the living area became the center of my paranoia. I kept imagining the person on the other end, watching my every action, noting the smallest gestures, waiting for me to let my guard down. Rationally, I told myself I had no proof anyone was actually observing in real time. But that voice of reason was drowned out by an overwhelming sense of exposure, a chilling intimacy that left me raw and vulnerable. I tried to sleep in the bedroom, away from the living room where the camera was, but the entire apartment had been compromised. Shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, corners seemed darker, and every reflective surface, from the windows to the polished countertops, felt like an extension of that lens, a potential avenue of observation. I couldn't escape it. The apartment felt alive, but this time alive in a human, calculating way. Someone had anticipated my movements, every glance, every sigh, and every private action. Around midnight, I thought I heard a faint click from the living G area, a subtle mechanical sound that made my heart pound. I froze in bed, straining to listen. The silence that followed was deafening, every second stretching unbearably. Then I noticed the faint red glow of a recording indicator flashing from the camera. My stomach churned. I wasn't just imagining it. Somebody had rigged the device to capture me silently with patience and intent. Panic overtook rational thought. My hands shook violently as I considered my options. I could leave immediately, but even then, how would I be sure the footage hadn't already been transmitted, saved, or watched? Every instinct told me to confront the camera, destroy it, or at least cover it, but fear held me back. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever installed it could still be monitoring my actions in real time. The air grew heavy with tension, every creak of the apartment sounding like a footstep. I stayed motionless for what felt like hours, listening, waiting, trying to detect any additional signs of intrusion. The realization that someone had been present in my private space, watching, observing, recording without my consent, was suffocating. It wasn't a ghost, a spirit, or a shadow. This was tangible, methodical, human malevolence. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted, trembling, and hyper-aware of every surface, every corner, every potential hiding spot. The apartment, once neutral and safe, now radiated a silent threat. That night, the violation of trust, the sense of being meticulously observed, left an indelible mark on my mind. The incident had changed me. I could no longer assume privacy in any rented space, and every reflective surface, every shadow, every nook seemed to harbor the possibility of unseen observation. I realized that fear doesn't always come from what you see. It comes from the invisible, calculated presence that watches while you are powerless to intervene. I left that Airbnb feeling violated in a way that no one could truly understand. It wasn't the usual unease from staying in a strange place. It was deeper, more personal, almost intimate. I knew without a doubt that someone had been watching me, recording me, observing every small, mundane action without my consent. Even the most rational part of my mind struggled to reconcile the fact that a person could invade my private space so thoroughly, yet remain invisible. That knowledge gnawed at me relentlessly, a cold, sharp edge slicing through any attempt at normalcy. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the lens, the red recording light flashing in the corner, capturing every gesture, every movement, every vulnerable moment. I replayed that night endlessly in my mind, trying to trace every step, every breath, every instinct that had been manipulated. Even ordinary, everyday motions now felt tainted by paranoia. I checked every apartment, every hotel, every space I stayed in afterward with obsessive care. Every reflective surface, every small corner became suspect. I could no longer relax, could no longer trust the privacy of any space. The psychological impact was profound. I became hyper-aware, hyper-vigilant, constantly anticipating intrusion, constantly imagining eyes where none should exist. Even in my own home, I felt vulnerable, exposed, as though the apartment had left a permanent mark on my perception of personal safety. Every creak of a floorboard, every flicker of light, every unexpected shadow became a potential signal of observation. The violation of trust was more than just emotional. It had altered the way I engaged with the world, leaving me on edge, exhausted, and suspicious of the most mundane environments. I replayed the scenario endlessly, considering the meticulousness of whoever had placed the camera. This was not an act of impulse. It was deliberate, calculated, patient. The thought that someone could watch me without my knowledge, study my behaviors, anticipate my reactions, and remain completely undetected filled me with dread. The apartment itself had become a symbol of vulnerability, of the fragility of personal space, of the hidden threats that can exist behind seemingly normal walls. Even now, months later, I cannot enter a rental without imagining the possibility of hidden observation. Every Airbnb, every guest house, every unfamiliar room is approached with suspicion, my guard permanently raised. The experience changed me fundamentally. Fear does not always come from what you can see. Often it comes from what you cannot, an unseen presence, a calculated watchfulness, the knowledge that someone else knows more about you than you realize. That night, the hidden camera didn't just record me, it reshaped the way I see the world, leaving me eternally wary, hyper-aware, and haunted by the invisible eyes that may still be watching. I thought I had learned my lesson after the previous rentals, the paranoia, the subtle manipulations, the hidden cameras, but when I booked this particular Airbnb, I told myself it would be different. The listing promised a cozy apartment in a quiet neighborhood, fully private, with a simple description that emphasized comfort and safety. Photos showed a tidy living space, a small bedroom, and a bathroom that looked recently renovated. It was exactly what I needed. A place to rest, a place to feel normal again, away from the constant fear that had started to cling to me. The first evening went smoothly. I arrived in the early evening carrying my luggage up a narrow flight of stairs. The host had left a polite note. "Welcome. Make yourself at home. The door locks automatically." At first the apartment felt safe. I unpacked slowly, arranging my belongings, checking every corner for anything unusual, just a habit now, ingrained after months of unsettling experiences. Nothing seemed out of place. The air was still, clean, and quiet, and the faint hum of the heater added a comforting background noise. I felt almost at ease. It wasn't until later that night that I noticed something strange. The door to the spare room, which I hadn't planned to use, had a lock that clicked differently than the main door. It wasn't broken. It was precise, secure, almost deliberate. Curiosity nudged me forward, but a faint unease tugged at my chest. I tested the handle, locked, as expected, but the way it resisted my grip, the subtle vibration I felt through the doorknob, was unnatural. Not mechanical, not a flaw. It felt intentional. I dismissed it at first, attributing it to fatigue and nerves, but something about that lock made my skin crawl. The rest of the evening I found myself glancing toward that locked door. The shadows in the corner of the hallway seemed to shift ever so slightly, just out of the corner of my eye. Every creak of the apartment, every hum from the heater, every minor sound of the building settling felt amplified, focused around that door. Rationally, I knew it was just nerves, exhaustion, or the remnants of previous experiences coloring my perception. But my gut instinct told me something was waiting behind it, something deliberate, patient, and unseen. By midnight, sleep was impossible. I lay in bed, listening to the faintest noises emanating from the spare room. At one point, I thought I heard a soft scrape against the wall, like a slow, deliberate movement just beyond the door. My heartbeat spiked, my palms damp with sweat. I considered unlocking it, peering inside, but a deeper, more primal fear kept me frozen. That door wasn't just locked physically, it had become a psychological barrier, a threshold between safety and the unknown, and crossing it felt impossibly dangerous. The night dragged on, heavy and suffocating. Every sound in the apartment seemed magnified, every creak or groan of the building making my heart jump. I lay in bed, staring at the closed door to the spare room, feeling a weight pressing against my chest that had nothing to do with physical pressure. It was anticipation, dread, the knowledge that something unseen was waiting, patient and aware of my presence. Rational thought tried to intervene. The apartment was empty. The host had left no instructions about that room, and logically, nothing should be there, but every instinct in my body screamed otherwise. Hours passed, or at least they felt like hours. I could hear subtle movements, soft, almost imperceptible, a faint scrape of what I imagined might be furniture, a slight shift in air pressure, the quietest hint of motion behind the locked door. I considered checking, unlocking it, confronting whatever might be there, but a deep, visceral fear kept me rooted to my bed. It wasn't just fear of what I would find, it was fear of the unknown, of crossing a threshold that I had no control over. My imagination, already frayed from previous experiences, filled in the gaps with every possible scenario, each more terrifying than the last. Then came a sound that made my blood run cold, a deliberate, slow knocking from the inside of the locked door. Not the casual knock of someone seeking entry, but a measured, patient, almost mocking rhythm. 1, 2, 3, pause. Repeat. My pulse raced as I pressed my back into the headboard, holding my breath, trying to tell myself it was just a draft, a settling noise, my mind playing tricks. But the precision of it, the timing, the weight behind each knock defied explanation. It was deliberate, and it was personal. I grabbed my phone, debating whether to call the host, the police, anyone. My fingers trembled violently as I held the device, but before I could even unlock it, the knocking stopped. Silence enveloped the apartment in a way that was almost more terrifying than the sound itself. I lay there, eyes wide, listening to the faintest whispers of air and imagining movement behind the door. Every instinct told me to leave immediately, but something, a mixture of curiosity and terror, kept me paralyzed. I felt trapped in my own fear, unable to act, unable to rest, while the locked door seemed to radiate presence, awareness, and silent menace. By the first hints of dawn, exhaustion overtook my terror, but the fear hadn't disappeared. It had settled into my bones. The locked door wasn't just wood and metal. It was a boundary, a psychological barrier that had challenged my courage and shaken my sense of reality. I realized that the door wasn't merely a physical object. It had become a symbol of vulnerability, a reminder that some boundaries once crossed or even approached can change everything. The apartment, the locked door, and whatever lay behind it had altered my perception permanently, leaving me anxious, hyper-aware, and aware that safety is sometimes only an illusion. I left that Airbnb the next morning feeling drained in a way I had never experienced before. It wasn't just fatigue from travel or sleeplessness. It was an exhaustion born from the fear that had taken root in every corner of my mind. The locked door, which I had feared and obsessed over all night, lingered in my thoughts like a living entity. The deliberate knocking, the faint scraping noises, the almost sentient presence I had sensed. It all followed me, embedding itself deep in my consciousness. Even rational explanations such as creaking floorboards, drafts, or imagination failed to provide comfort. I knew what I had experienced was real, though I couldn't explain it. In the following days, I found myself replaying every detail over and over. Every movement I made in that apartment became a source of anxiety, every sound a potential threat. Shadows seemed more vivid, corners darker, and every locked door, regardless of its context, evoked the same unease I had felt that night. The apartment had taught me that safety is fragile, that even a place you trust can harbor unseen forces, and that the human mind, when confronted with subtle threats, can be both hyper-aware and paralyzed with fear. I couldn't sleep properly for over a week. Even at home, I found myself imagining the locked door, picturing it closing and opening in response to my movements. I would check the locks on my apartment obsessively, walk through hallways multiple times, and scan every room before settling in. My sense of vulnerability had become permanent, leaving me anxious and vigilant in ways that were exhausting and isolating. I felt violated not physically, but mentally, emotionally, and psychologically. The experience also changed the way I approached new spaces. I could no longer trust the layout of a room, the security of a lock, or even the familiarity of everyday objects. Every element of a rental property became a potential source of danger, a subtle manipulation I might not notice until it was too late. That locked door had not only held a presence behind it, it had altered my perception, making me question every boundary and every assumption I had previously taken for granted. Months later, the memory of that night still haunts me. The locked door is no longer just wood and metal in my mind. It is a symbol of unseen threat, of psychological intrusion, and of fear that lingers long after the immediate danger is gone. I have learned that some experiences leave marks that cannot be erased, that some places remain alive in memory long after we have left them, and that the unknown, patient, and unseen is sometimes more terrifying than anything we could ever see. I had learned to approach every new Airbnb with a mix of curiosity and caution, but nothing could have prepared me for the experience that awaited me in this particular building. The listing promised a cozy one-bedroom apartment in a quiet residential complex, conveniently located near shops and public transport. The host's photos were bright and cheerful, showcasing clean floors, minimalist decor, and sunlight streaming through the windows. I had arrived late in the evening, tired from a long train journey, and I was eager to settle in. At first glance, everything seemed perfectly ordinary. The building itself had an unassuming exterior, brick walls, a modest lobby, and a narrow stairwell that creaked slightly under my weight. I noticed a few residents in passing, a middle-aged man with an expressionless face who seemed to watch me carefully, a woman humming quietly in the hallway, and a child who darted behind a corner as soon as he saw me. There was nothing overtly threatening about them, but something in their behavior set my nerves on edge. The air felt charged, like a tension I couldn't explain, a subtle energy that hummed beneath the surface of everyday life. The apartment was small but welcoming. The host had left clear instructions in a brief note. "Hope you enjoy your stay. Don't hesitate to ask if you need anything." I unpacked my things, tried to settle in, and attempted to shake the feeling that I was being observed. That sensation, unfortunately, did not leave. Even when I closed the door and locked it behind me, I couldn't shake the sense that I was not alone in the building, that eyes were tracking my movements. Every creak in the floorboards, every distant laugh or cough seemed amplified, carrying a subtle significance that made me anxious without reason. Over the first few hours, I noticed strange patterns. The neighbors would appear at odd times, lingering near the doorways or peering from the staircase. Sometimes I would hear faint murmuring, soft words that seemed directed at me but were indistinguishable. When I left the apartment, the same people were often watching from windows or balconies, their expressions unreadable, their attention unnervingly precise. The air of normalcy in the building was deceptive. Behind the mundane exterior, I could feel something carefully orchestrated, patient, and watching. By nightfall, my unease had grown into a gnawing dread. I felt like a character in a play where everyone else knew the script except me, and every glance or subtle movement from the neighbors was a line delivered with chilling precision. The apartment itself no longer felt safe, and the residents had become an omnipresent, silent force, observing and calculating. I realized that this experience would challenge everything I believed about privacy, trust, and the invisible influence of others, an unsettling journey that would make me question not just the strangers around me, but my own sense of reality. That night I began to feel the building itself was alive, almost aware of my presence. Every sound seemed amplified, every movement deliberate. The ordinary noises of an apartment, distant footsteps, a door closing, the hum of an air conditioner, took on a sinister rhythm. It was as if the walls themselves were observing me, and the neighbors were part of a silent conspiracy, orchestrating moments to keep me off balance. I tried to tell myself it was paranoia, that I was reading too much into the coincidences, but my instincts screamed otherwise. Around midnight, I was woken by the faintest scratching against my door. I froze, straining to hear, my pulse pounding in my ears. The sound came again, soft, deliberate, almost patient. I gripped my phone as a lifeline, debating whether to call the host or the police. Rational thought battled raw fear. It's just a neighbor, I told myself, probably a kid or someone coming home late. But the timing, the pattern, the uncanny precision of the sound suggested otherwise. Whoever or whatever was responsible was attuned to me, to my every move. Then came the whispers. They were faint, incoherent, almost carried on the wind, but unmistakably coming from the hallway outside my apartment. I could hear the subtle shifts of bodies, the soft padding of footsteps, the occasional pause followed by barely audible murmurs. It wasn't loud enough to understand words, but loud enough to make me certain I was the subject of deliberate attention. I tried to lock the door tighter, to pull the curtains closed, but every measure felt futile, as if my precautions were anticipated and negated. The fear escalated when I noticed movement through the peephole. Shadows flitted just outside, moving in a pattern that suggested observation rather than simple passing. I held my breath, heart racing, eyes fixed, waiting for a confrontation that never came. It was the awareness, the patience, the subtle, almost theatrical way the neighbors orchestrated their presence that unsettled me the most. Every glance, every footstep, every whisper seemed designed to make me doubt my own senses, to erode my confidence and control. By dawn I was trembling, my body exhausted, my mind racing. The neighbors were ordinary people on the surface, indistinguishable from anyone else in a quiet residential building. But their subtle, constant presence had turned my stay into a psychological trap. The apartment, once a neutral and safe space, had become a stage for careful observation, an arena in which I was the unwilling participant. The incident didn't involve violence or overt threats, yet it left me hollowed out, my perception of safety and privacy irrevocably altered. Leaving that apartment was like stepping out of a carefully constructed illusion into a world I no longer fully trusted. The strange neighbors, their subtle glances, the soft whispers, and the deliberate presence had left an indelible mark on my mind. Even days later, I could feel the weight of their silent observation, the calculated way they had manipulated my environment to unnerve me. The incident was subtle, almost imperceptible to an outsider, but the psychological toll was profound. I had been watched, assessed, and influenced in a way that left me questioning everything I thought I knew about safety and privacy. Every subsequent Airbnb stay became a test of my nerves. Shadows seemed heavier, corners darker, and casual noises amplified with meaning. I found myself checking and rechecking doors, windows, and locks, scrutinizing neighbors from a distance, imagining their eyes on me even when I was alone. Even mundane actions, making a cup of tea, reading, moving around a room, were tainted by the memory of being observed, and I could no longer move through unfamiliar space as with ease. The apartment had taught me that even ordinary, seemingly benign people could wield a quiet, terrifying power over perception, using subtle cues and patience to unnerve, destabilize, and control. Sleep was the hardest part. Every creak in the house, every rustle from the street outside, and even the softest hum of the refrigerator triggered memories of that night. I would lie awake, imagining the neighbors outside my door, their voices low, their movements deliberate. Rational explanations, exhaustion, imagination, coincidence, were powerless against the intensity of the lingering dread. The fear wasn't just in my mind, it had become embodied, a visceral physical sensation that left me tense, jittery, and constantly alert. Months later, I still carry the experience with me. The memory of the neighbor's quiet, patient surveillance remains, shaping how I interact with strangers, how I choose rentals, and how I move through unfamiliar spaces. The apartment was more than a physical location. It was a psychological trap, a reminder that some threats are invisible, orchestrated with subtlety, and designed to erode trust in ways that cannot be measured. The fear it instilled didn't fade with distance or time. It became part of my understanding of the world, a permanent marker of vulnerability, paranoia, and the fragile boundaries between safety and exposure. The strange neighbors were never overtly threatening, never violent, but their presence altered the course of my perception and left me hyper-aware in ways that continue to influence my choices, my behaviors, and my sense of personal security. They demonstrated that sometimes horror exists not in overt acts, but in the quiet, invisible manipulation of the familiar, and that the most profound fear comes from the unseen forces that shape our reality without ever revealing themselves. After my previous experiences, I thought, I had grown more cautious, more vigilant. I checked reviews meticulously, confirmed hosts' identities, and studied every detail of the listings before booking. But when I found this particular Airbnb, I convinced myself it would be safe. The listing described a charming, isolated cottage on the outskirts of a small town, promising privacy, tranquility, and the kind of quiet retreat I craved. The photos were picturesque, ivy crawling up the exterior walls, a small garden bathed in sunlight, and a cozy interior decorated with rustic furniture. It was exactly the escape I needed, or so I thought. I arrived in the late afternoon, the air crisp and tinged with the scent of autumn leaves. The host had promised to meet me in person, leaving a note on the door. "I'll see you shortly to give you the keys and show you around." I waited, but as minutes stretched into an hour, I began to feel an unfamiliar unease. The street was empty, the surrounding cottages silent, and the sun was dipping behind the horizon. The isolation, which had seemed charming in the photos, now felt suffocating. The quiet wasn't peaceful, it was expectant, as though the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. Eventually, I tried calling the host, but the phone rang endlessly with no answer. I walked up and down the street, scanning windows and porches, looking for any sign of life. Nothing moved, no lights flickered. My gut tightened with a sense of growing dread. The cottage, which had promised comfort and solitude, now felt ominous. It was empty, but the absence of the host, who had been a promised presence, left a palpable void. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched, not by a person, but by the space itself, aware of my hesitation and uncertainty. The moment I stepped inside, that feeling intensified. The interior was warm and inviting at first glance. The furniture neatly arranged, the kettle on the stove, the faint aroma of vanilla lingering in the air. Yet, a subtle, off-putting detail caught my attention, small signs of recent activity that didn't match my arrival. A chair had been pulled back slightly, footprints were faintly visible on the wooden floor, and a window was cracked open just enough to let in a chill. It was as though someone had been there very recently but vanished without a trace. My rational mind tried to dismiss it. Perhaps the host had returned and left briefly, but the silence that followed was heavy, oppressive, and unexplainable. As night fell, the reality sank in. I was completely alone. The host had vanished entirely, and I was left to navigate the cottage in isolation, with only the faint, eerie hints of their recent presence. Every creak of the floorboards, every subtle draft through the cracked window, became magnified, as though the house itself was aware of me, conscious and observing. That night, the promise of a peaceful retreat became a crucible of anticipation and fear, setting the stage for an experience that would challenge my perception of trust, solitude, and the unsettling unknown. As the night settled over the cottage, the silence became almost unbearable. Each tick of the old clock on the wall seemed amplified, echoing in the otherwise empty house. I kept telling myself the host would return, that perhaps they had stepped out to gather supplies or attend to something nearby, but the rational explanations did little to soothe my growing unease. Every creak, every draft, every subtle shift in the house heightened my awareness, and I felt as though I was being observed. Not by a person, but by the empty space itself, alive in some inexplicable way. Around midnight, I began, and to notice subtle signs that something, or someone, had been moving through the house. Footsteps that weren't mine seemed to echo faintly in the hallway, almost too light to be noticed unless I focused intently. A chair that had been neatly tucked away earlier was slightly out of place, as if someone had brushed past it. My heart raced with the realization that I was not truly alone, despite the total absence of the host. Each minor detail, previously dismissed as the quirks of an old house, now felt deliberate, almost taunting. Then I saw movement from the corner of my eye, a shadow slipping across the far end of the living room, too fast to identify but unmistakably there. I spun around, heart pounding, but no one was there. My mind screamed for logic. It could be a trick of the dim lighting, my imagination magnified by fear. Yet the feeling of being watched intensified. It wasn't merely a sense of paranoia. It was a tangible awareness, as if the house itself and its vanished occupant were tracking my movements, silently ensuring I understood my vulnerability. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but stepping outside into the dark, empty yard felt equally dangerous. I considered calling the host again, even dialing local emergency numbers, but the idea of revealing my presence seemed to heighten the tension, as though someone, or something, was waiting to see what I would do next. I sat frozen on the couch, heart racing, trying to listen for any definitive sign of movement. The whispers of the wind through the trees sounded eerily like voices, soft murmurs that seemed to echo my own fear. By the early hours of the morning, exhaustion set in, but the dread didn't fade. The vanished host had left their mark on the space, subtle, deliberate, and omnipresent. Every sound, every shadow, every minor irregularity in the cottage felt orchestrated to unsettle me, to break down the boundaries between safety and fear. I realized with a chilling clarity that the absence of a presence can be more terrifying than an overt threat. The vanished host had transformed the cottage into a psychological labyrinth, one in which I was trapped alone and under constant scrutiny, leaving an impression of vulnerability and helplessness that would linger long after I finally stepped outside. Leaving that cottage, I felt hollowed out in a way I had never experienced before. The vanished host had transformed what should have been a tranquil retreat into an unsettling, oppressive environment where every corner and shadow seemed infused with presence, despite the complete absence of anyone else. Even after I drove away, the weight of the experience clung to me like a persistent fog. My thoughts were consumed by questions I had no answers to. Where had they gone? Had they ever truly been there? Or was their disappearance part of a carefully orchestrated plan to manipulate my perception and emotions? The ambiguity itself was what left the deepest scar. In the days and weeks that followed, I noticed the profound changes in my behavior and perception. Simple acts that I had once taken for granted, walking into a new apartment, opening a door, turning on a light, now triggered hypervigilance and unease. I double-checked locks obsessively, scanned rooms for signs of tampering, and felt a constant gnawing anxiety that I could be watched at any moment, even when alone. The cottage had demonstrated, in the most subtle and psychologically precise way, how the absence of a person could be weaponized, leaving an indelible mark on the mind long after the physical space was behind me. Sleep became irregular and tense. Every creak, every whisper of wind, every flicker of light seemed to echo the vanished host's silent presence. I would lie awake, imagining movement behind doors, shadows shifting along walls, or faint noises that hinted at someone just out of sight. The isolation I had sought had been replaced by an omnipresent tension, a constant awareness of unseen observation. Even rational explanations, imagination, fatigue, or the quirks of an old house, felt powerless to alleviate the psychological grip that the experience had imposed. Months later, the memory of that night still influences how I engage with the world. The vanished host taught me that horror is not always immediate, tangible, or overt. Sometimes it exists in absence, in uncertainty, in the calculated manipulation of perception. The cottage was more than a location. It became a psychological trap, and the host's disappearance was the tool through which my mind was reshaped. I am now forever aware that solitude can be deceptive, that the human mind can fill empty spaces with dread, and that trust in seemingly safe environments is fragile. Even today, I find myself pausing before entering any rental or unfamiliar space, listening for faint sounds, observing shadows, and anticipating anomalies. The vanished host, though never physically present again, left behind a lingering, pervasive fear, a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying experiences are the ones where the antagonist is entirely invisible, yet their influence is undeniable. It is a fear that doesn't dissipate, it transforms, embedding itself into every act of caution, every glance at a darkened hallway, and every decision to trust or retreat. By the time I arrived at this last Airbnb, I had grown weary of the constant tension, the subtle psychological games, and the creeping fear that had accompanied every stay over the past months. I told myself this one would be different, a simple, short-term rental for just 2 nights. Nothing complicated, nothing secluded. The listing described a modern apartment in a bustling city neighborhood, clean and well-lit, with clear instructions for self-check-in. The photos showed a bright living space with large windows, a small balcony, and a pristine kitchen. I clung to these images and the promise of normalcy like a lifeline. I arrived in the late afternoon, luggage in hand, the city alive with sounds of traffic, distant conversations, and the faint hum of activity beyond the windows. The apartment building was ordinary. Brick facade, polished lobby, and a functional elevator. No unusual creaks, no unsettling corners, no ominous notes. The bustling city life outside seemed to provide a reassuring contrast to the isolation and paranoia that had haunted previous rentals. I felt a small sense of relief, almost disbelief, that I could enter a space without immediate unease. The self-check-in instructions were straightforward. I found the key lockbox, entered the code, and opened the door. Immediately, I noticed a faint scent of lemon cleaner, a sign the space had been prepared meticulously. The apartment was spotless, furniture arranged neatly, and sunlight poured through the large windows, casting warm patterns on the hardwood floors. I unpacked slowly, appreciating the ordinary rhythm of a mundane routine, placing clothes in the dresser, setting up my toiletries, arranging my laptop on the desk. For the first time in months, I allowed myself a fleeting sense of ease. But the unease never fully left. Even in this well-lit, modern apartment, subtle details drew my attention. A slightly crooked picture frame, the hum of the refrigerator that seemed louder than necessary, and the faint but distinct echoes of distant footsteps in neighboring units. Each observation, while ordinary, became a focus of heightened awareness. My past experiences had taught me to scrutinize everything, to anticipate hidden threats, and to remain alert, even when surroundings appeared perfectly normal. I knew, deep down, that the simplest details could harbor the most unsettling surprises. As night approached, I made a conscious effort to relax. I prepared a small meal, sipped tea on the balcony, and watched the city lights flicker in the distance. Yet, even in this ordinary setting, a subtle tension persisted. The apartment, while seemingly safe, reminded me that no environment is truly neutral, and that the mind, once attuned to fear, never fully returns to innocence. The final checkout was approaching, and I couldn't shake the sense that something might emerge in the remaining hours. A last lingering brush with the unknown, before my journey through these unsettling Airbnbs came to an end. Night fell over the city, painting the apartment in shades of shadow and artificial light. I tried to settle into a sense of normalcy, convincing myself that this rental would be uneventful, that it would finally offer respite after the months of anxiety and fear that had accompanied every previous stay. Yet, as I moved about the apartment preparing for bed, an inexplicable tension began to creep in. The sounds of the city, which had seemed comforting earlier, now felt distant and hollow, almost as though the space around me had absorbed them and held them just out of reach. Around midnight, the faintest noise caught my attention. A soft, deliberate tap, tap, tap coming from the balcony door. My first instinct was to rationalize, perhaps a bird on the railing or the wind nudging something loose. But the taps continued, slow and measured, as if deliberate. I froze, listening intently, heart pounding in my chest. Each tap seemed to echo in the apartment, magnified by the quiet night, until it became impossible to ignore. My rational mind faltered under the weight of growing anxiety, and I realized that my previous experiences had left me primed for terror even in the absence of clear threat. Then came another sound, the faintest whisper, almost inaudible, brushing against the edges of perception. I couldn't make out words, but it felt directed, intentional. I moved closer to the balcony, careful not to disturb whatever unseen presence might be there, peering into the city night beyond. The streets were empty in the immediate vicinity, lights flickering in distant windows, nothing visibly moving. And yet, the sense of being observed, of being silently tested, remained overpowering. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run, to escape the apartment before the unseen entity made its presence undeniable. The tension escalated further when the lights flickered brief. Lie. A stutter in the illumination of the apartment. For a moment, the shadows in the corners deepened, and I could almost swear I saw movement, just at the edge of vision, too fast and subtle to identify. The apartment that had seemed ordinary, safe, and modern had become a stage for my own imagination to spiral, each minor sound amplified, each shadow interpreted as deliberate. I sat on the couch, heart racing, hands clammy, convinced that something was testing the boundaries of my perception. By the early hours of the morning, the tapping and whispers ceased, leaving an eerie, suffocating silence. I was physically exhausted but mentally alert, hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow, and every object in the apartment. The incident didn't involve overt violence or intrusion, yet the psychological impact was profound. It was a reminder that even in a seemingly safe, ordinary environment, the mind can manufacture, or perceive, threats that leave lasting unease. The final checkout, which I had hoped would bring closure, instead cemented a lingering, almost tangible dread, reinforcing that the unseen and unexplained often leaves the deepest impression. Leaving that apartment, I expected relief, a sense of closure after months of unsettling experiences in Airbnbs that had steadily eroded my sense of safety. Instead, I carried with me a lingering unease that refused to fade. The final incident, subtle yet profoundly affecting, had reinforced a truth I had reluctantly begun to accept. Fear does not always arrive in the form of visible threats or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it is insidious, quiet, and psychological, leaving marks that are far more enduring than any physical encounter could. The tapping, the whispers, the brief flicker of lights, they weren't overtly threatening, yet they altered my perception, imprinting an unshakable hyper-awareness into my mind. In the days that followed, I found it nearly impossible to relax in any enclosed space, no matter how ordinary it appeared. Every apartment, hotel, or rental I entered after that night carried echoes of the final Airbnb. The subtle awareness of being watched, the fear that unseen forces could manipulate my surroundings. Shadows, ordinary sounds, and even the quiet hum of appliances became sources of acute anxiety. I realized that the human mind, once primed for fear, cannot easily return to a neutral state. The experience had rewired my instincts, making vigilance constant and relaxation fleeting. Sleep was particularly affected. Nights became a battlefield of imagination and memory. Every creak in my home, every windblown rustle, and every distant city sound was amplified, triggering flashbacks of the final checkout. I would lie awake, heart pounding, imagining the subtle movements and whispers that had left me so unsettled. Even in broad daylight, my awareness of the environment remained heightened. I double-checked locks, scanned rooms meticulously, and found myself avoiding unfamiliar spaces when possible. The final Airbnb had become a permanent lens through which I viewed all living spaces, an invisible marker of vulnerability, uncertainty, and latent fear. Emotionally, I felt drained, yet hyper-alert, exhausted, yet unable to fully let go. The incident reinforced the idea that the unseen can wield as much, if not more, power than the visible. The apartment was ordinary, modern, and ostensibly safe, yet it had left a profound impression on me, proving that horror can thrive in subtlety, ambiguity, and psychological manipulation. Even after leaving, the presence I had felt, though unidentifiable and perhaps imagined, lingered as a reminder that complete control is an illusion, and that some experiences refuse to be confined to memory. They live in perception, shaping the way I move, observe, and trust. Reflecting on the series of Airbnb horrors, the final checkout became symbolic. It wasn't the most dramatic or terrifying, but it encapsulated the essence of fear I had experienced throughout, quiet, personal, and disorienting. It reminded me that sometimes the most unsettling experiences leave no clear evidence, no tangible adversary, yet they alter our understanding of safety and presence forever. The apartment, and the subtle events within it, became a lasting imprint, an invisible scar marking the conclusion of a journey through unseen terror.